You can go home. Interns don't get paid overtime." The words were flat, not cruel, just dismissive, like the hum of fluorescent lights overhead that never turned off, and Ava Brooks nodded like she always did. A small motion, almost invisible, the kind that didn't interrupt anyone's night, didn't change the rhythm of keyboards or the quiet authority in the room. But she didn't move, not right away, her fingers still resting on the edge of her desk, feeling the faint vibration of the building's HVAC system beneath the polished surface. The office stretched out around her in clean lines and cold glass. Manhattan glowing faintly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, 27 floors up where everything looked distant enough to feel manageable. Even failure, even fear, even the way people like her seemed to fade into the background of places like this. Ava exhaled slowly, her breath barely visible in the chilled air, and glanced toward the far row of desks where Emily Carter sat frozen in front of her screen, shoulders tight, one hand gripping her hair as if holding herself together, the soft blue light of her monitor reflecting in her wide, unblinking eyes, numbers and charts scattered across the screen like something broken beyond repair. No one else seemed to notice anymore. The floor had thinned out over the last hour, heels replaced by silence, conversations replaced by the low mechanical hum of machines left running overnight. Ava reached for her bag, fingers brushing the worn strap, and paused, just for a second, because she saw it, the way Emily's hands trembled as she scrolled, the way her lips moved without sound, rehearsing something that wasn't working, and Ava had seen that look before, not here, not in a place with marble floors and filter water stations, but in smaller rooms, older buildings, places where mistakes cost people more than just reputation. She shifted her weight, eyes flicking briefly toward the security camera mounted high in the corner, its small red light blinking steadily. Indifferent, always watching but never intervening. Then back to Emily, who suddenly leaned forward, pressing her palms flat against the desk as if grounding herself, and whispered something too quiet to hear. Ava swallowed, the taste of stale coffee still lingering, and set her bag back down without a sound, the zipper barely whispering as it settled against the desk. She stepped lightly across the carpet, each footfall absorbed into the thick gray weave, until she reached the edge of Emily's space, stopping just far enough not to startle her. "Hey," Ava said softly, her voice careful, like placing something fragile on a table. Emily flinched anyway, turning sharply, eyes glossy, cheeks flushed with the kind of pressure that builds quietly before it breaks. "I'm fine," Emily said too quickly, her voice tight, and Ava nodded once. Not arguing, not pushing, just letting the silence sit. For a moment, heavy but not hostile. Then she glanced at the screen, lines of data misaligned, formulas broken somewhere deep in the structure, the kind of error that didn't just show up, it spread, slow and destructive. Ava leaned in slightly, not touching anything yet, just looking, really looking, her brow softening as she traced the logic backward in her mind. Piece by piece, "This part," she said gently, pointing near the middle of the sheet. "It's referencing the wrong range." Emily blinked, confusion cutting through the panic for a split second. "What?" Ava didn't rush, didn't make a moment about being right. She pulled up a chair and sat beside her, the fabric cool beneath her, and began to explain, step by step, her voice steady low, like a rhythm you could follow when everything else fell off. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass. Inside, the office held its breath, and somewhere above them, unseen, a man who never stayed past 6 paused in front of a wall of screens, his hand hovering over a control panel, eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the small figure of an intern who had been told to leave, stay anyway. Emily stared at the screen as if it might betray her again, her breathing uneven, fingers hovering just above the keyboard without touching it, like she no longer trusted what they might do. And Ava did not rush her, did not take control. She simply sat there, steady, present, the faint scent of printer toner and cooled coffee lingering in the air around them. "Look," Ava said quietly, her voice calm enough to slow the moment down. "It is not broken everywhere, just here." She tapped lightly. near a column that had shifted out of alignment. This formula is pulling from the wrong data set. Emily leaned closer, eyes narrowing, trying to follow the panic in her. Chest still loud, but now competing with something else, something smaller and quieter, understanding. But I checked that. Emily whispered, almost defensively, and Ava nodded, not correcting her, not challenging her, just opening the spreadsheet history and scrolling back with careful clicks. Each movement deliberate. You did, Ava said, but this update here, it changed the reference range. She pointed again, slower this time, letting Emily see it, really see it. The mistake was not loud. It was not obvious. It was the kind that hid in plain sight. And Emily exhaled, a shaky breath that seemed to release just a fraction of the weight pressing down on her shoulders. "Oh my God," she murmured, covering her mouth briefly. "This isn't a final report." Ava nodded once, her expression unchanged, steady as before. "Then we fix it," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if staying past 10 o'clock in an office that did not expect her to exist beyond basic tasks was not something unusual, as if helping someone who had barely spoken to her all week did not require a second thought. Emily hesitated, glancing at the time in the corner of her screen, 10:42 p.m., the building long past its official hum. "You do not have to stay," Emily said, her voice softer now, less sharp, almost uncertain. Ava gave a small shrug, barely lifting her shoulders. "I know," she replied, and then she turned back to the screen, already rewriting the formula with precise keystrokes, the clicking of keys echoing lightly in the quiet space, steady, consistent, like a metronome guiding them forward. Minutes passed, then more. The spreadsheet began to stabilize, columns snapping back into place, numbers aligning the way they were supposed to. Emily leaned in closer, following each step, asking questions now, her voice tentative at first, then clearer, more confident. Ava answered each one without impatience, breaking things down, not just fixing the problem, but explaining it, making sure it would not happen again. Outside, the city had softened into a distant glow, traffic reduced to thin lines of light, the office around them dim, except for the island of brightness at their desks. And high above, in a room no one on this floor ever entered, Daniel Whitmore stood with his arms loosely crossed, eyes fixed on a single screen among many he had intended to leave hours ago, had stayed only to review security protocols after a recent systems upgrade. But now he did not move, his gaze sharpened not by suspicion, but by something unfamiliar, something he did not immediately name. On the monitor, the intern did not rush, did not seek attention, did not even look up at the camera that watched her. She simply stayed, explained, corrected, and stayed again. And Daniel noticed the details he usually ignored, the way she paused before answering, making sure her words helped instead of impressed, the way she leaned back slightly to give the other woman space to understand, the way she never once reached for credit, not even in tone, not even in posture. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the quiet control room, and shifted his weight, still watching as below. The final error disappeared from the screen, and Emily let out a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes when something heavy finally lifts. "It is working," she said, almost to herself, and Ava only nodded, her hands resting lightly on the desk now, as if the work had always been meant to end this way, quiet, complete, and unseen. The clock in the corner of the screen turned to 11:18 p.m., and the number seemed louder than it should have been, like a quiet reminder of how long the world had already moved on without them. Emily leaned back slowly in her chair, her shoulders dropping for the first time that night, the tension in her face softening into something almost unfamiliar, relief, but not complete, not yet, because relief always carried the echo of what almost happened. She glanced at Ava, really looked at her now. Not as the intern who refilled the printer paper or sat quietly in meetings taking notes no one read, but as the person who had just pulled her back from something that could have ended more than just a project. "I do not even know how you saw that," Emily said, her voice quieter, more honest. Ava gave a small shrug again, the same understated motion. "I read everything twice," she replied, like it was nothing, like it did not take patience, discipline, or the kind of care most people abandoned. When they thought no one was watching, Emily let out a short breath, half laugh, half disbelief, and shook her head, her fingers brushing over the keyboard again, this time not in panic, but in confirmation, checking, verifying, trusting. If this had gone through like that, she stopped herself, the thought unfinished but understood. Ava did not fill the silence. She simply closed the last open window on the screen and leaned back slightly, her eyes flicking toward the darkened rows of empty desks. The office now fully still, like a place holding its breath between days. It did not, Ava said, her tone steady, not dismissing the fear, just placing it where it belonged in the past. Emily nodded slowly, absorbing that, letting it settle. Then she turned slightly in her chair, facing Ava more directly now. "Why did you stay?" she asked, the question simple, but carrying weight because it was not really about time. Ava paused for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk again. Feeling that same faint vibration beneath the surface, she thought about answering quickly, something easy, something forgettable, but instead she looked at the screen, now clean, aligned, working, and then back at Emily. "Because you needed help," she said, and there was no performance in it, no attempt to sound noble, just a statement, plain and complete. Emily blinked, her expression shifting, something in her understanding breaking open just enough to let something new in, something uncomfortable and warm at the same time. She looked down at her hands, then back at the screen, then at Ava again, like she was recalibrating everything she thought she knew about this place, about who mattered and who did not. "We should tell them," Emily said suddenly, the words coming out faster now, driven by a mix of gratitude and urgency. "I mean, you did most of this, they should know." Ava's gaze did not change. She shook her head once, small but firm. "No," she said quietly. Emily frowned, confused. "What do you mean, no?" Ava turned slightly in her chair, facing the window for a brief second, the city lights reflecting faintly in her eyes. "It is your report," she said, then looked back at Emily. "You present it." Emily hesitated, the weight shifting again, different this time, heavier in a more complicated way. "That does not feel right," she admitted. Ava gave a faint smile, barely there, the kind that passed quickly if you were not paying attention. "It is fine," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that closed the conversation without force, without argument, just quiet certainty. Emily opened her mouth as if to push back again, then stopped, something in Ava's expression telling her this was not about recognition, not about credit. It was about something else, something steadier, more rooted, and above them. Daniel Whitmore leaned slightly closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing just enough to catch every detail, every word, every pause. He had seen ambition before, had built his company on it, had rewarded it, expected it, but this was different. This was someone stepping away from recognition when it was right in front of her, someone choosing not to be seen when being seen would have changed everything. He felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not discomfort, not exactly respect yet, but something close, something that made him stay where he was long. After he had planned to leave, as below, Ava reached for her bag again, this time lifting it from the desk, the strap sliding over her shoulder, her movements quiet, almost careful not to disturb the stillness she had helped create. "You are really just going to go?" Emily asked softly. Ava nodded once, already stepping back from the desk. "Yeah," she said, simple. And then she turned, walking toward the elevator without looking back, her footsteps fading into the soft carpet, leaving behind a screen that worked, a co-worker who would never see things the same way again, and a man watching from above who had just realized he had missed something far more valuable than numbers. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime, and Ava stood alone inside the mirrored box, her reflection staring back at her from 3 angles at once, shoulders slightly slouched, eyes tired but steady, the faint crease between her brows still there from hours of focus. She adjusted the strap of her bag without thinking, the fabric worn smooth where her fingers always gripped it, and as the numbers above the door ticked down one by one, the quiet finally settled in. No keyboards, no voices, just the low mechanical hum and her own breathing, slow, controlled, like she had trained herself to keep everything contained. She did not smile, did not replay the moment, did not imagine what might come next, because experience had taught her that moments like that rarely came with recognition. They came and went unnoticed like she did most days in that building, and she was used to that. Or at least she had learned how to live with it. The doors opened to the lobby, wide and polished, the marble floors reflecting the dimmed overhead lights like still water. The security desk half occupied by a guard scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up as she passed. Her footsteps echoed, faintly now, no longer softened by carpet, each step more defined, more real. She pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the cool night air, the city greeting her with a rush of distant traffic and the occasional honk of a cab. A breeze moved between the buildings, lifting a strand of her hair across her cheek, and she pulled her coat tighter, the fabric brushing against her wrists, grounding her in the present. Across the street, a food cart was closing down, the metallic clang of utensils being packed away, carrying through the air. A man counted bills under a small overhead light. Everything ordinary, everything continuing, as if nothing had shifted at all. Ava walked toward the corner, her pace unhurried, the red glow of the crosswalk signal reflecting faintly in her eyes as she waited, hands tucked in her coat pockets, the warmth of the office already fading from her skin. Behind her, 27 floors up, Daniel Whitmore had not moved from the screen, his posture still, but his focus sharper now. He reached forward slowly and rewound the footage, not the part where the error was fixed, not the numbers aligning, but the moment before when she chose to stay. He watched the small pause again, the hesitation that lasted less than a second, the way her hand touched her bag and then stopped, the decision made in silence, without anyone asking, without anyone offering anything in return. He exhaled quietly, something in his chest tightening in a way he did not expect, because he had built his world on measurable things, outcomes, performance, results that could be tracked and rewarded, but this did not fit into any report he had ever reviewed. He pressed play again, watching her explain, watching her step back so the other woman could understand, watching her refuse credit without hesitation. And for the first time in a long time, the room around him felt too quiet, not efficient, not controlled, just empty in a way he had not noticed before. He straightened slightly, his reflection faint in the dark glass of the monitors, and for a brief moment he saw himself the way others might, distant, composed, always moving forward without stopping long enough to notice who was left behind. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. Something, small but undeniable, shifting beneath the surface, down on the street. The light turned green, and Ava stepped forward with the crowd, blending into the movement of people heading home, her figure quickly becoming just another silhouette among many. No spotlight, no acknowledgement, just motion, steady and quiet, and above it all, in a room filled with screens. A man who had seen everything realized that the most important moment of the night had almost been the one he ignored. Morning came quietly, not with noise, but with light, pale and thin through the glass walls of the office, stretching across desks that had already begun to fill again, keyboards waking up one by one, voices returning in low conversations about meetings and deadlines and things that could be measured. Emily sat at her desk earlier than usual, her screen already open, the report in front of her, complete, clean, accurate. She had checked it 3 times before anyone else arrived, not because she doubted it, but because she needed to believe it. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the desk, the same place Ava's had been hours before, and she could still see it. The quiet way she worked, the way she explained without making it feel like a lesson. Emily exhaled slowly, her chest tightening just a little as she glanced toward the empty chair where Ava usually sat, still unoccupied, still unnoticed by most of the floor. "Morning," someone said as they passed, and Emily nodded absently, her focus already shifting back to the email draft on her screen, the subject line blinking. Waiting, she hesitated, her cursor hovering over the body text, and for a moment she considered it, writing everything out exactly as it happened, naming Ava, explaining, correcting the story before it even began, but her fingers did not move, not yet. Across the floor, conversations picked up. Heels clicked softly against the polished surface, the hum of the office rebuilding itself piece by piece, and then a voice cut through it, calm, controlled, familiar in a way that made the room subtly shift. "Emily, my office. 10 minutes. Daniel Whitmore did not raise his voice, did not need to. The authority in it carried without effort. Emily's head lifted immediately, her stomach tightening as the words settled. She nodded even though he had already turned away, her heart picking up just enough to remind her what was at stake. She glanced at the report again, then at the email draft, still blank, and closed it, her fingers pressing the keys with quiet finality. 10 minutes later, she stood outside his office, the glass door reflecting her back at her, posture straight, expression composed, but her hand hesitated just before knocking. She took a breath, then another, and lifted her hand. 2 light taps against the glass. "Come in." His voice came from inside, steady as ever. Emily stepped in, the office cooler than the floor, the air still, controlled. Daniel stood near the window, not behind his desk, looking out over the city for a brief second before turning to face her, his expression unreadable. "The report," he said. No greeting, no introduction, just the point. Emily nodded quickly, stepping forward, placing the printed copy on his desk, her fingers brushing the smooth surface for just a second longer than necessary. "It is finalized," she said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. Daniel glanced down at the pages, flipping one, then another, his movements precise, practiced. He did not rush, did not react. The silence stretching just long enough to make her aware of every small sound in the room, the faint ticking of a clock somewhere, the soft shift of paper under his hand. Then he stopped, his eyes lifting from the report to her, not sharp, not accusing, but focused in a way that made it impossible to look away. "Who fixed it?" he asked, the question simple, but it landed heavier than anything else he could have said. Emily's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, her mind flashing back to the night before, the quiet voice beside her, the steady hands, correcting what she could not, the way Ava had already chosen to disappear from the outcome, and now. The choice sat in front of her again, clearer, sharper. Daniel did not move, did not repeat the question. He simply watched, waiting, and for the first time since she walked into the building that morning, Emily understood that this moment mattered more than the report itself. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, her pulse steady but firm, and she opened her mouth to answer. Emily's lips parted, but no words came out at first, the silence stretching just enough to make her aware of her own heartbeat, steady but louder now, echoing faintly in her ears. Daniel did not interrupt, did not shift. He simply stood there, waiting, his gaze calm but precise, the kind that did not pressure, yet did not allow escape. Emily swallowed, her eyes flicking down to the report for a split second, then back up to him. And she felt it again, that moment from the night before, Ava's voice, quiet and certain. "It is your report." And for a second, it would have been easy, so easy, to nod and take it, to let the story settle into something clean and convenient, something that would move her forward without complication. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, and she took a slow breath. "I had help," she said finally, her voice not loud, but steady, the words landing softly in the space between them. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Not surprise, not quite approval, just attention. "From who?" he asked, the question immediate, but not aggressive. Emily hesitated again, not out of fear this time, but out of respect for the choice that had been made for her. She could still see Ava walking away, not looking back, not asking for anything. And that mattered now, more than it had the night before. "Ava Brooks," she said, the name clear, fully given. Daniel's gaze held hers for a moment longer, then shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like a piece of information finding its place. "The intern," he said, more to confirm than a question. Emily nodded. "She stayed late," she added, her voice gaining a little strength now. "She found the error, and she walked me through fixing it." Daniel looked down at the report again, flipping one page back, then forward, as if seeing it differently now, not just as a finished product, but as something that carried a process, a presence. "And you chose not to mention that in your submission," he said, his tone still even, but the words landed heavier this time. Emily felt it, the weight of that truth, and she did not look away. "I was going to," she said, honest, even if it sounded incomplete, "but she told me not to." Daniel's fingers stilled on the edge of the page, and for the first time, there was a pause that came from him. Not from her, a small one, but enough to shift the balance of the room. She declined credit, he said, almost quietly. Emily nodded again. Yes. Daniel closed the report slowly, the soft sound of paper settling, echoing faintly in the office. He did not speak immediately, his gaze moving past Emily for a brief second, toward the glass wall, where the city stretched out beyond, bright and distant, his reflection faintly visible against it. And in that reflection, there was something different now. Not a change in posture, not a visible expression, but something internal, recalibrating. He turned back to her. "And you told me anyway," he said. Not a question, just a statement. Emily's shoulders lifted slightly with a quiet breath. "Yes," she answered. Simple. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. "Good," he said, the word understated. But it carried more than approval. It carried recognition, not just of the work, but of the choice. He stepped past her toward his desk, setting the report down with measured precision. "Send me her full name and employee file," he added, his tone returning to its usual controlled clarity. But something in it had shifted, softened just slightly beneath the surface. Emily blinked, a small flicker of surprise crossing her face before she nodded quickly. "Yes, of course," she said, turning toward the door, her hand reaching for the handle. But she paused for just a second, glancing back. Daniel was already looking at the report again, but not the same way as before, not just scanning, not just evaluating. And as Emily stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the office returning around her, she felt it. Not relief this time, not exactly, but something steadier, something that felt like alignment, like the truth had landed where it was supposed to. And inside the office, Daniel Whitmore stood still for a moment longer, his eyes resting on a single name that had not been there before, Ava Brooks. And for the first time, it was not just another entry in a system. It was someone he intended to find. The email arrived at 9:17 a.m., quiet and unannounced. Just another notification among dozens that filled Ava's screen each morning. She had just sat down, her bag still resting against the side of her chair, her coffee untouched, the faint steam curling upward and disappearing into the office air. She clicked it without thinking, expecting instructions, maybe another task, another line in a day that usually passed without interruption. But the sender made her pause. Daniel Whitmore. She blinked. Once, then again, as if the name might shift into something more familiar, something less direct. But it stayed clear and undeniable. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad for a second before she opened it fully. The message was short, precise. "Please come to my office at 10 a.m. No explanation, no context, just a time and a place. Ava sat still for a moment, the noise of the office continuing around her. Chairs moving, conversations starting, keyboards clicking into rhythm. But her focus narrowed to that single line. Her heartbeat picked up slightly, not fast, not panicked, just aware. She glanced at the clock in the corner of her screen. 9:18 a.m., 42 minutes, enough time to think, maybe too much. Across the room, Emily noticed the shift before Ava even realized it herself. The way she stopped moving, the way her posture changed just slightly. "Hey," Emily said softly, stepping closer, careful not to draw attention. "You okay?" Ava looked up, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharper now. "I got an email," she said, turning the screen just enough for Emily to see. Emily leaned in, reading it quickly, and her breath caught just a little. "Oh," she said, the word carrying more than surprise, something like anticipation mixed with concern. Ava gave a small nod, closing the email, her fingers smoothing over the edge of her desk without realizing it, grounding herself in something physical, something steady. "Do you think this is about last night?" Emily asked, her voice lower now, almost careful. Ava did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting for a second toward the glass offices lining the far wall, where decisions were made quietly, often without explanation. "I do not know," she said finally. "Honest?" Emily straightened slightly, her expression shifting into something more certain. "If it is, you should tell him," she said, the words coming out quicker now, more urgent. Ava looked at her, a faint crease forming between her brows. Tell him what? Emily hesitated, then met her eyes directly. Everything, she said. Simple. Ava's lips pressed together briefly. Not in resistance, but in thought. She could feel it, the weight of the moment building slowly. Not dramatic, not loud, just present, like pressure before a storm that might not even come. She glanced down at her hands, then back at Emily. It was your report, she said quietly, repeating what had already been decided. Emily shook her head. Just once. It was our fix, she corrected. Her voice softer now, but firm. Ava did not respond. Not because she disagreed, but because something in her had already settled into place the night before, something that did not shift easily. Across the office, the clock moved forward, minutes passing without asking permission, and above them, in a space most employees never saw, Daniel Whitmore stood near his desk, a single file open in front of him. Ava Brooks. The name centered on the page. Her resume clean, but understated. Her experience. Solid, but not extraordinary on paper. Nothing that would have made her stand out in the systems he trusted. And yet he had seen something those systems could not measure, something that did not appear in metrics or performance reviews. He tapped the edge of the file lightly with his finger. Once, then stopped, his gaze lingering on the name, not searching for flaws, not questioning qualifications, but considering something else entirely: timing, intention, character, things he had rarely. Paused long enough to evaluate. The office around him remained quiet, controlled, but his focus was no longer on efficiency. It was on understanding. And as the clock on his wall approached 10 a.m., he closed the file gently, not with finality, but with decision. Down on the main floor, Ava stood slowly from her chair, adjusting her sleeve, smoothing a crease that no one else would notice, her breath steady, her steps measured as she moved toward the hallway, the glass doors ahead reflecting. Her back, at her once more, not different, not transformed, just clearer somehow. And as she reached for the handle, the noise of the office softened behind her, leaving only the quiet certainty that whatever waited on the other side would not be ignored this time. The hallway felt different when the door closed behind her, not louder, not quieter, just narrower somehow, like the space itself was asking her to focus. Ava walked forward with steady steps, the soft carpet absorbing the sound beneath her feet, the glass walls on either side reflecting fragments of her movement, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her fingers brushed lightly against her sleeve again, a small habit, grounding, reminding her she was still in control of herself. Even if she did not know what waited ahead, at the end of the corridor, Daniel Whitmore's office stood slightly apart from the others, larger, cleaner, the glass more transparent, nothing hidden, and yet everything inside it felt out of reach. Ava stopped just outside the door, the faint outline of him visible through the glass, standing near his desk, still, as if he had been waiting longer than necessary. She lifted her hand and knocked twice, the sound soft but precise. "Come in," his voice came immediately, calm, unchanged. Ava pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air cooler, the light sharper, the city stretching wide behind him through the floor to ceiling windows for a second. The scale of it all pressed in, the height, the distance, the quiet control of the room. But she did not let it linger. She stepped forward and stopped at a respectful distance, her hands relaxed at her sides. "You asked to see me," she said, her voice even, neither too soft nor too strong, just present. Daniel studied her for a moment, not the way people usually did, not scanning for flaws or dismissing her place in the hierarchy, but observing carefully, like he was matching what he saw now with something he had already witnessed. "Ava Brooks," he said, her name clear, deliberate. She nodded once. Yes. He moved slightly, gesturing toward the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." Ava hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then took the seat, her movements controlled, the chair. Cool beneath her, she rested her hands lightly in her lap, not fidgeting, not shrinking, just still. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, then walked slowly around his desk and picked up a thin file. He did not open it right away. Instead, he looked at her again. "You stayed late last night," he said. Not a question. Ava met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Yes." He tilted his head slightly, The smallest shift. That was not required of you. Ava nodded, acknowledging the fact without argument. No, the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was deliberate, like each word needed space to land. Daniel set the file down on the desk, his fingers resting lightly on its edge. Then why did you do it? He asked, the question simple. But this time was not about process, not about work. It was about something else entirely. Ava paused, her eyes lowering briefly to the surface of the desk, the faint reflection of light across it, then lifting again to meet his, because she needed help, she said. The same answer as before, unchanged, without decoration. Daniel watched her closely, not searching for hesitation, not expecting something more, just listening, really listening, the way he had not done in a long time. And when the work was done, he continued, you chose not to be mentioned. Ava's fingers shifted slightly against each other, not nervous, just acknowledging the direction of the conversation. It was her report, she said again. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition of a pattern, a consistency that was becoming harder to ignore. Do you always remove yourself from the outcome? He asked. Ava blinked once, the question unexpected in its framing. She considered it for a moment, not rushing to answer. No, she said finally, just when it is not mine to take. The words settled between them, quiet but firm, and something in the room shifted again, subtle but real. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze moving briefly toward the window, the city stretching out below, full of people moving, working, choosing, and then back to her. Most people would have done the opposite, he said, not as criticism, but as fact. Ava did not respond to that, not because she disagreed, but because it was not relevant to her decision. The silence held for a second longer. Then Daniel reached for the file and opened it, glancing at the contents briefly before closing it. Again, as if confirming something he already knew, I reviewed the footage, he said, his voice steady. Ava's eyes did not widen, did not shift, but there was a small pause in her breathing, almost imperceptible. I saw everything, he added, and this time the words carried weight. Not threatening, not accusing, just complete. Ava held his gaze, not defensive, not afraid, just present. And for the first time since she entered the room, Daniel allowed a fraction of something else to surface in his expression, not a smile, not yet, but something closer to respect, something earned, not given. You made a choice, he said quietly, when no one was asking you to, and Ava did not interrupt, did not downplay it. She simply sat there, letting the truth exist without needing to reshape it. And in that stillness, something settled into place between them, not fully understood yet, but no longer invisible. Daniel's words did not fade after he spoke them. They stayed in the air, quiet but present, like something that had weight even without volume. Ava felt it, not as pressure, not as fear, but as recognition, the kind that did not come often and did not need to be explained. She sat still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly in her lap, but her focus sharpened just slightly. Yes, she said, her voice calm, not defensive, not seeking approval, just acknowledging what was already true. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, as if measuring the space between intention and action, something he had built his entire career on, but rarely questioned beyond results. Most people wait to be asked, he said, stepping slowly back toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass. They wait for permission or recognition, or at least a reason that benefits them. Ava listened, her eyes following him briefly before settling again. Steady. You did not, he added, turning slightly, his gaze returning to her. Ava's fingers shifted once, lightly brushing against each other, a small movement, almost unconscious. It needed to be done, she said, simple, and again, there was no performance in it, no attempt to make it sound like something more than it was. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something he was not used to naming. Do you think that always matters? He asked, the question quieter. Now, less structured. Ava paused, her eyes lowering briefly. Not to avoid, but to consider. She had been asked questions before in interviews and evaluations, questions designed to test knowledge, skill, readiness. But this felt different. This was not about what she knew. It was about what she believed. Not always, she said after a moment, lifting her gaze again. but it mattered last night. Daniel held her eyes. The answer settling into place without resistance. He nodded once, small, deliberate, then walked back toward his desk, resting his hand lightly against its edge. "You are an intern," he said, not dismissive, just factual. Ava nodded. "Yes, temporary," he added. Ava nodded again. "Yes." Daniel's jaw shifted slightly, as if he was aligning something internally, something that did not fit the structure he was used to, and yet he continued, his voice steady. "You demonstrated judgment, initiative, and restraint that I do not see from people with 10 years of experience." Ava did not react outwardly, but something in her chest tightened just slightly, not from pride, but from the unfamiliar weight of being seen accurately, not partially, not incorrectly, just as she was in that moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "because anything more would have felt unnecessary." Daniel studied her again, then reached for a pen on his desk, turning it once between his fingers before setting it down. The motion small, but intentional. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, and this time there was a shift in his tone, not authority, not instruction, but something closer to invitation. Ava straightened just slightly, not tense, just attentive. "Yes," she said. Daniel's gaze did not waver. "If you were in her position again," he said, "and no one was watching, would you make the same decision?" The question landed differently, not about the past, but about the pattern, about consistency. Ava did not answer immediately, not because she hesitated, but because she understood the weight of repeating something that had already defined her once. She took a small breath, steady, controlled, and met his gaze fully. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "I would." The room held that answer for a moment, longer than necessary, longer than comfortable for most people, but neither of them moved to break it. Daniel nodded slowly, once, as if confirming something that no longer needed proof. Then he stepped away from the desk, moving toward the side table where a second chair sat unused. He paused there, his hand resting lightly on the back of it. And for the first time since she entered the room, there was no distance in his posture, no barrier of position or expectation, just presence. "Good," he said quietly, and the word carried more this time. Not just acknowledgement, but decision, something forming just beneath the surface, something that would not stay contained much longer. And Ava, sitting across from him, did not know what would come next, but she could feel it, the shift that had already begun, the moment when being unseen was no longer an option. Daniel did not sit back down. He remained standing beside the chair, his hand resting lightly on its edge, as if the decision forming in his mind required him to stay in motion, not settled, not fixed. Ava watched him without shifting, her posture steady, her breathing even, but there was a subtle awareness now, the kind that comes just before something changes direction, not dramatically, but permanently. Daniel turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the window again, the city stretching out. Below, endless movement, endless decisions made every second without pause, and for a moment he seemed to measure something against that scale. Then he looked back at her. "There is a meeting at 11:30, he said, his voice returning to its usual clarity, but not its distance. "Senior leadership, final review on the same report." Ava nodded once, not interrupting, not assuming where this was going. "Emily will present," he continued, and there was no judgment in it, just structure. Ava nodded again. "Yes." Daniel stepped closer to the desk, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface before stilling. "I want you there," he said, the words simple, but they carried weight. Ava blinked once, not out of confusion, but because the request did not fit the pattern she had learned to expect. "In the meeting?" she asked, her voice calm, but quieter now. Daniel met her gaze directly. "Yes." Ava paused for a moment, her mind moving quickly, not racing, but aligning understanding. What that meant, what it did not mean, and what it could change as what? She asked, not challenging, just clarifying. Daniel's expression remained composed, but there was a shift in his eyes, something more direct. "Now, as someone who understands the work," he said. Ava held his gaze, the answer settling into place, not as a promotion, not as recognition in the way most people would define it, but as something else, something more immediate, more real. "Emily should present it," she said, her voice steady. Daniel nodded once. "She will." Ava's fingers moved slightly in her lap, a small motion, grounding. "Then why am I there?" she asked. Daniel did not answer right away. He walked back toward the window, stopping just short of it, his reflection faint in the glass. Because if questions come up, he said slowly, I want the person who actually solved the problem in the room. The words were direct, without embellishment, and they landed with a clarity that did not leave room for misunderstanding. Ava felt it, the shift from being invisible to being acknowledged, not publicly yet, not formally, but undeniably. She took a small breath, her shoulders lifting just slightly before settling again. I did not solve it alone, she said, the correction quiet but firm. Daniel turned his head slightly, not fully facing her, but enough to acknowledge the statement. No, he agreed, but you chose to stay when no one else did. Ava did not respond to that, not because she disagreed, but because it was not something she needed to claim. The silence held for a moment. Then Daniel stepped back toward his desk, his posture settling now. Decision made. Be in conference room B at 11:20, he said, his tone returning to instruction, but not losing the layer beneath it. Ava nodded once. Okay, she said. Simple. Daniel glanced at her for a brief second longer, as if confirming something one last time, then gave a small nod, dismissing her without words. Ava stood, her movements controlled, the chair shifting softly behind her. She turned toward the door, her hand reaching for the handle. But she paused for just a fraction of a second, not looking back, just standing there, feeling. The moment settled into memory. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The noise of the office returning gradually, the rhythm of work continuing as if nothing had changed, but something had, quietly, beneath the surface. And as she walked back toward her desk, the same path she had taken countless times before, it no longer felt exactly the same, not because the building had changed, but because someone inside it had finally decided to see her differently. Conference room B felt colder than the rest of the floor, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The long glass table stretched across the center like a boundary. Chairs already occupied by people who did not look up when Ava stepped in, their attention fixed on tablets, printed decks, quiet conversations that carried the weight of authority without needing to raise their voices. She paused just inside the door for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but to take in the rhythm of the room, the cadence of decision-making that moved faster here, sharper, less forgiving. Emily stood near the front, a tablet in hand, her posture straight, but her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the screen, a small, unconscious movement that gave away the tension beneath her composure. She glanced up when she saw Ava, just for a moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, not relief, but acknowledgement, like seeing a steady point in a room that did not offer many. Ava gave a small nod in return and moved quietly along the wall, taking a seat near the end of the table, not drawing attention, not claiming space, just present. The chair cool beneath her, her hands resting lightly on her lap again. The same controlled stillness she carried with her across the table. Voices continued. We need to finalize projections before noon, someone said, their tone firm. Another voice responded, layered with confidence. Numbers were referenced, timelines discussed. The language precise, efficient, and above it all, Daniel Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his posture unchanged, his presence anchoring the room without effort. He did not speak yet, but his attention moved, measured, taking in each detail, and when his gaze passed briefly over Ava, it did not linger, but it did not dismiss either. It registered clearly, like placing a marker that would not be moved. Let us begin, Daniel said finally, his voice cutting through the room without force. The conversation stilled almost immediately, attention aligning toward him. He gave a slight nod toward Emily. You have the floor. Emily stepped forward, her breath steadying as she began. This report outlines the adjusted projections based on corrected data inputs. Her voice was clear, controlled. She moved through the slides with practiced precision, charts appearing, numbers aligning, the story of the data unfolding the way it was supposed to. And as she spoke, Ava watched, not critically, not anxiously, just attentively, her eyes following the logic, confirming each step internally. The room responded as expected, heads nodding slightly, questions forming in silence, until one voice broke through. These corrections, A senior partner leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled. What triggered the revision? Emily paused just for a fraction of a second, not enough to be obvious, but enough to feel. Ava saw it, the moment where the answer could split in two directions again, the same choice, just in a different room, under brighter lights. Emily inhaled quietly, her gaze steady. We identified a discrepancy in the data references during a late review, she said, her words careful but honest. The partner nodded slowly, not fully satisfied. And who identified it? The question came sharper this time, not hostile, but direct, the kind that required precision. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the tablet, her eyes flicking briefly toward Ava. Not for permission, not for guidance, but for alignment. Ava did not move, did not signal. She simply met her gaze, steady, the same quiet presence as before, and in that second, Emily understood again. What mattered was not the answer that protected her, but the one that remained true. She turned back to the table, her voice steady. Ava. Brooks, she said, clear, without hesitation. The room shifted, subtle but immediate. A few heads turned, eyes moving toward the end of the table where Ava sat, still composed, the same as before, but no longer invisible. Daniel's gaze followed theirs, not searching, not questioning, just confirming what he already knew. And in that moment, the room changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, because someone who had entered quietly was now part of the conversation, whether they expected it or not. The room did not react loudly. There were no sudden movements, no raised voices, but the shift was immediate, like air pressure changing before anyone names it. A few executives leaned back slightly in their chairs, eyes narrowing with interest rather than dismissal. Others glanced down at the report again, as if recalibrating what they had just reviewed. And at the end of the table, Ava did not move, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly in her lap. But she felt it, the weight of attention settling on her in a way it never had before, not as scrutiny, not as judgment, but as recognition. Ava Brooks, the same senior partner repeated, this time more slowly, as if anchoring the name into the room, his gaze fixed on her now. You identified the discrepancy. Ava met his eyes, steady, without hesitation. Yes. Her voice was calm, not amplified, not diminished, just clear. The partner tilted his head, slightly, studying her, not with skepticism, but with curiosity sharpened by experience. Walk me through it, he said, direct, the kind of request that was not optional. Ava nodded once, shifting forward just slightly in her chair, not to perform, but to engage, her hands resting now on the edge of the table, fingers relaxed. The reference range in the core model shifted during a late update, she began, her tone measured, each word placed carefully. It pulled from a data set that was not aligned with the revised projections, which created a cascade effect across the summary outputs. As she spoke, the room quieted further, not because they had to, but because they were listening, truly listening. She did not rush, did not over-explain. She moved through the logic step by step, the same way she had the night before, not to impress, but to clarify. And as she spoke, heads began to nod, small at first, then more certain. The partner leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping, once against the table, then stilling. And the correction, he prompted. Ava continued without pause, re-anchored the formula to the correct data set, then validated each dependent field to ensure consistency across projections. She stopped there, not adding more than necessary, letting the explanation stand on its own. The silence that followed was different now. Not uncertain, not questioning, but considering. The partner leaned back slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward Daniel. Then, back to Ava. You caught something that would have gone unnoticed until much later, he said, not a compliment, but a fact. Ava gave a small nod, acknowledging it without claiming it. Yes. Daniel, who had remained silent until now, shifted slightly in his chair, his hands resting calmly on the table, but his presence drawing focus without effort. She did more than catch it, he said, his voice even, but carrying authority that did not need to be raised. The room turned toward him, attention aligning instantly. She stayed, corrected it. and ensured it would not fail again. He added, his gaze moving briefly to Ava, then back to the table. And in that moment, the acknowledgement became something official, not in title, not in formality, but in truth spoken in front of those who mattered. Ava felt it, not as validation she had been waiting for, but as something that settled quietly into place. Something earned without asking. Across the table, Emily stood still, her grip on the tablet loosening just slightly, her shoulders easing as she watched the moment unfold. Not with surprise, but with a quiet sense of rightness, like something had aligned the way it should have from the beginning. The partner gave a slow nod, then looked back at Ava. "Good work," he said, simple, but this time it carried weight, not because of the words, but because of who they came from. Ava inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice unchanged, steady as before, and for a moment, the room held that exchange, not dramatic, not loud, but meaningful in a way that did not need explanation. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze moving across the table, then settling again. "Let us continue," he said, and just like that, the meeting resumed. Numbers, projections, decisions moving forward, but something had shifted beneath it all, something that would not return to what it was before, because the person who had once been unseen was now part of the foundation the room was building on. The meeting ended without ceremony. Chairs shifting back, papers gathered, conversations resuming in low, controlled tones as people stepped out one by one, decisions already moving forward beyond the room. But Ava remained seated for a moment longer, not because she needed to, but because she felt the weight of what had just happened settle into something quiet and real. The glass walls reflected fragments of movement, silhouettes passing, voices fading, and across the table, Emily exhaled. Slowly, her shoulders dropping as she set the tablet down. "You did great," she said softly, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. Ava gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, but there was something warmer beneath it now, not pride, not relief, just a steady calm that came from knowing she had not stepped outside of herself to be seen. She had simply stayed the same. And that had been enough. She stood then, smoothing her sleeve again out of habit, and turned toward the door, but before she reached it, Daniel's voice came from behind her. "Ava," it was not loud, but it did not need to be. She paused and turned back, the room nearly empty now, only a few executives lingering at the far end. Daniel stood at the head of the table, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, not less controlled, but less distant. "Walk with me," he said, and it was not a command, not exactly. Ava nodded once and stepped toward him, matching his pace as they moved out into the hallway. The noise of the office returning around them, but softer now, as if it no longer pressed the same way. They walked in silence for a few steps, the rhythm of their footsteps even, measured, until Daniel spoke again. "You did not ask for recognition," he said, not as a question. Ava glanced at him briefly, then forward again. "No," she replied, simple. Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze forward. "Most people do," he said. Ava did not respond to that, not because she disagreed, but because it was not something she needed to argue. They reached the glass corridor outside his office, the city stretching beyond it, bright and endless. Daniel stopped there, turning slightly to face her. "That does not mean it should be ignored," he said, and this time, the words carried something more defined, something that had moved from observation into decision. Ava held his gaze, her posture steady. "I was not trying to prove anything," she said quietly. Daniel's expression shifted just slightly, not disagreement, but acknowledgement. "I know," he said, and for the first time, there was no distance in it all, just clarity. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small card, placing it between his fingers before extending it toward her. Ava looked at it for a brief second, then took it, the paper smooth against her fingertips. "I want you to come back next week," he said, not as an intern. The words settled, quiet but unmistakable. Ava did not react immediately, not because she did not understand, but because she did fully, and she was measuring it against something deeper than opportunity, something that had nothing to do with title. "I will think about it," she said after a moment, her voice steady. Daniel watched her, not surprised, not offended, just attentive. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said, and there was something in that word now, something that reflected not just approval but respect. Ava gave a small nod in return, slipping the card into her bag, then turned to leave, her steps the same as they had been before, unhurried, grounded. She walked back through the office, past desks, past conversations, past the same spaces that had once absorbed her without notice, and nothing around her had changed. Not the lights, not the people, not the pace, but something within it had shifted permanently, not because she demanded to be seen, but because she chose to act when it mattered. And someone finally understood what that meant. And as she reached her desk, setting her bag down with the same quiet motion as always, the screen lighting up in front of her, she did not look different, did not stand taller, did not carry herself any louder than before, but in a building full of power and noise, she had done something far rarer. She had reminded someone at the top what decency felt like. And that was enough.